The jewel box era of ballparks was perhaps the best era of ballparks. Views were great, features were unique, and the ballparks had character. Despite this, all but 2 of these historic ballparks still exist. So what about the many others that don't? What happened to them? And what are they now? In this video, we will take a look at all of them, one by one. This is the fates of the jewel box ballparks. Starting out, we will go to Detroit, to one of the most famous jewel box parks no longer in existence, and that is Tiger Stadium. This stadium operated from 1912 to 1999 and hosted both the Tigers and for a long period the Lions. It would serve Detroit well, however by its final decade, ownership desired a new stadium. There was effort to try to keep it, but ultimately it would be vacated by the team following the '99 season. Strangely though, it was not immediately torn down, and would stand at least partially for another decade, with demolition finally starting in 2007 and then being completed in 2009. After being torn down, the site was essentially a vacant lot, with the stadium's infield and flagpole remaining until 2018, when Detroit's Police Athletic League opened a small ballpark on the site, with housing on the edge just outside of the outfield, with the flagpole and original field dimensions remaining. Next we have Ebbets Field, which was the home of the Brooklyn Dodgers from 1913 to 1957. Ebbets would see some of the best days of the Dodger franchise, hosting 9 World Series with the team doing particularly well in the stadium's final decade. Eventually though, space limitations, aging infrastructure, and a changing surrounding neighborhood made it so that plans were made at replacing it by the late 40s and early 50s. A dome was actually planned as a replacement, but never happened, and the Dodgers would move to LA after 1957. The stadium stood for 3 more years and then was demolished for apartments. Moving on to St. Louis, we have Sportsmans Park, which would exist from 1881 to 1966. Baseball's Browns and Cardinals would play there, and the stadium would see a wide variety of modifications throughout its life. The Browns would eventually leave in 1953, leaving just the Cardinals, who would put money into the stadium as late as the 1950s. By the 60s, however, the trend was shifting towards cookie-cutter multi-purpose stadiums, and the Cardinals would oblige in this, vacating the stadium for St. Louis's cookie-cutter Busch Stadium in 1966. Sportsman's would be demolished quickly after, with a baseball field remaining on site at the location of a boys' club. Next we have Boston's Braves Field, which operated from 1915 to 1952. The Braves would play second fiddle to the Red Sox and Fenway Park at this stadium, and would never achieve the status they desired here. The dimensions were constantly an issue in addition to lagging attendance numbers. Attendance here would eventually drive the team out in 1953 for Milwaukee, and the stadium was purchased by Boston University. While much of the stadium was torn down in the 50s and 60s after the purchase and switch of the stadium to Boston University's football stadium, an original entire section and the ticket building remain through today. Now known as Nickerson Field, it is used for various sports, while the ticket building is the university's police HQ. Next we have Pittsburgh's Forbes Field. This stadium would operate from 1909 to 1970 as the home of the Pittsburgh Pirates. The first steel and concrete ballpark, it was a pioneer and innovator in stadium tech for its time. It would, as Sportsman's Park, become a victim of the cookie-cutter multi-purpose stadium construction trend of the 60s and 70s, and would be replaced by Three Rivers Stadium in 1970. At the time, the stadium was already owned by the University of Pittsburgh for 12 years, and would subsequently be demolished the following year in 1971. The university would build student housing and a library in its place, though a portion of the outfield wall does remain through today in its original spot. Next we go to Philadelphia to the Baker Bowl. This stadium existed from 1895 to 1938 as the home of the Phillies. This stadium would have some of the most bizarre dimensions of any, with its right field being only 279 feet away from home plate, along with a strange notch in center field. To counter this, what would become the tallest fence/wall in MLB history would be erected at 60 feet tall. The availability of Shibe Park, which was literally down the street, and the aging stadium infrastructure of the Baker Bowl would lead the Phillies to vacate it in 1938. But the stadium would be used another 12 years for non-Phillies events until it was torn down in 1950. Today the site is a variety of buildings and businesses, including a car wash, strip mall, warehouse, and gas station. Next we have Kamiski Park, which was the home of the Chicago White Sox from 1910 to 1990. The stadium would see multiple team owners, each making changes as they saw fit. Even though it was over 70 years old by the early 80s, millions were spent on the stadium. However, ownership was not having another renovation project instead of a new stadium for the far future, and ultimately it would be torn down in 1991 for parking for its replacement, New Kamiski. Today it is that, with the original home plate circle marked next to the lot. Next we go to Cleveland, Ohio's League Park. The Cleveland Naps and Indians would play here from 1910 to 1946. Another stadium with bizarre dimensions, in this case looking more like a pure rectangle. It would be just 290 feet in right field, eventually necessitating a 40-foot tall fence in the outfield. It would have a replacement as early as 1931 in Cleveland Stadium, with the team vacating the ballpark for that stadium for part of 1932 and all of 1933. However, the team ultimately would keep playing most games at League Park afterward, until finally completely vacating it for Cleveland Stadium after 1946. In 1951, the stadium was sold to Cleveland, and much of it was torn down. However, a notable portion and its ticket house remained. What was left would fall into disrepair as the neighborhood declined, and what was left of the stadium's stands was torn down in 2002, leaving just a wall, some stairs, and the ticket house. The site would, however, be restored in 2014, with millions in redevelopment coming from the city, with the ticket house becoming a museum and the ball field being restored with original dimensions. The site functions as a museum and recreational baseball field through today. Next we have Washington, D.C.'s Griffith Stadium, which operated from 1911 to 1961 as the home of the Washington Senators. Featuring a strange outfield wall layout due to property restrictions, the stadium and team would fall out of favor with fans by the 1950s when nearby Baltimore would get a team in the St. Louis Browns, who would become the Orioles. The Senators would move to Minneapolis just before the stadium's end. Then a new expansion version of the Senators would play one season there before moving to RFK Stadium. Griffith would be vacated after 1961, sold, and in 1965 torn down for Howard University to build a hospital there, which still stands today. Next we have Shibe Park, also known as Connie Mack Stadium. It would operate for professional baseball from 1909 to 1970, though uniquely for two different teams. The Athletics from 1909 to 1954, and the Phillies from 1955 to 1970. Like several other jewel box stadiums, it would ultimately be replaced by a cookie-cutter multi-purpose stadium, in this case Veterans Stadium, which would be ready for the 1971 season. Not long after the then Connie Mack Stadium's vacating, it would be set on fire in an act of vandalism, severely damaging it, until in 1975 and 76 it was finally torn down. A church would be built at its former location 15 years later. Next we have what at least started as a jewel box ballpark, but probably was the least like one, and that is Yankee Stadium, which was the home of the New York Yankees from 1923 to 2008. The last built of these types of ballparks, it would also be much larger than the others, being able to hold 58,000, having a 3-tier grandstand. It would, however, become quite obsolete by the early 1970s, and a replacement plan was floated around then. But ultimately, a $100 million or $736 million in today's dollars renovation was done that got rid of much of what made it a jewel box ballpark. The grandstand roof and pillars were taken out and replaced with a new overhang without pillars. The wooden seats were gotten rid of, the outfield wall was changed to a curved wall and moved in, and the flagpole was no longer in play. A very different stadium in the rest of its life. It really lacked the look of a jewel box after this renovation. It would be demolished in 2009 after its closure in 2008, and is now a recreational park. Next we have Crosley Field, which existed from 1912 to 1970 as the home of the Cincinnati Reds. A pioneer in stadium tech, in 1935 it would have lighting added for night play, a first in MLB and a popular addition, resulting in attendance shooting up in large numbers. With the establishment of the Cincinnati Bengals requiring a venue, suburbanization, and decline in Crosley's neighborhood, the stadium would fall out of favor, and Riverfront Stadium would be built as a multi-purpose to replace it. Riverfront would open in mid-1970 for baseball, and Crosley would see its baseball end that year. It would be used as storage for auto impound briefly, but in 1972 was torn down. A modern dimensional replica field exists today in the Cincinnati suburbs, while the original site is a variety of businesses with some historical markers. Lastly, we have the final version of the Polo Grounds, which was the home of the New York Giants from 1911 to 1957, and briefly the Yankees from 1913 to 1922. This stadium would be remembered for having some of the strangest and widest variety of outfield wall distances, with walls as deep as 505 feet and as short as 258 feet. It would decline as a venue in its later years, along with attendance, and ultimately the Giants would vacate the stadium and New York for San Francisco. It would briefly be the home of the New York Mets for 2 years as a temporary venue from 1962 to 1963, but was finally torn down in 1964. Today it is housing projects. A set of stairs that would once go to the stadium is all that remains, aside from a plaque. All of these stadiums would decline for various reasons. Some fell with the neighborhood, others simply lost their teams, and some were just simply too obsolete to be saved. Regardless, they no doubt left a big mark on MLB and the cities they occupied, and today mostly live on in memory and whatever few parts may be left. Thank you for watching.